Hey, what's up? I'm Mark Aiello and I'm on a road trip across the country. I'm chilling at a hostel in Phoenix and it's my last week before I head home. I've been getting lots of different footage throughout the trip, some of which has been wildlife shooting on the Canon 75-300mm lens. And to be completely honest, it's been overall very difficult. I'm gonna get to that in a little bit, but first, money shot sequence please. This is my second commentary of my first ever travel series, where I will be talking about my experience filming my first ever big cross-country road trip, particularly with the Sony A7C. And today I will be talking about my experience using the Canon 75-300mm lens with the Sony A7C. I decided to bring this particular lens on the trip because I figured it would be great for shooting wildlife, which is one of my interests outside of filmmaking. I've always been fascinated by the vast megafauna of North America, from the massive deer to the bison and all the eagles and bighorn sheep that make up the ecosystem of this great land. However, I have absolutely no experience with shooting wildlife, so I am a total amateur in this regard. But, I saw this trip as a great opportunity, so I figured I'd give myself a little baptism by fire and pick up this lens and go film some animals. Now, the Canon lens was really all I had for a telephoto lens to really get those shots from a distance, which is essential for any outdoor shooting. So I attached the Canon 75-300mm lens to the A7C through the MC11 adapter, which is what I use for my Sigma lens, which is adapted for EF mounts. The MC11 adapter is really just meant to work with the Sigma lenses. And by the way, it works like a charm. This adapter matches perfectly between the Sigma and Sony, allowing the camera's outstanding autofocus technology to be compatible with my Sigma lens. However, my personal experience using this adapter with a Canon lens on this trip has been kind of dicey. So let me walk you through all the times I've used this lens throughout the trip. Although I did get to spot some wildlife on my drive in the Rockies, my first stop for shooting wildlife was Alamosa, Colorado, which is a neat little town right in the middle of the San Luis Valley. When shooting for wildlife, the first thing I noticed was that, depending on what time of day or what season it is, you can have a really hard time searching for any sign of animals. However, I was able to spot some porcupines as well as a herd of elk, which made me happy because I had never seen an elk in my life and always wanted to witness one. Now here's a couple problems to first point out when using this lens with the Sony, and to many of you this will be a no-brainer. But number one, the in-body image stabilization was terrible. And by terrible, I mean it was non-existent. I mean, a lot of the coverage I got was just shaky, and I found it very hard to stay still when I finally had a good shot. Number two, the autofocus was non-existent when shooting video, and I had to manually focus every single subject, which was just not an easy thing to do, especially when looking down at the small LCD screen. Sounds like a nightmare, right? Well, I still tried to adapt to the best I can. I visited the wildlife refuge a second time, now at sunset instead of morning, and I had much better luck for spotting animals. However, I'm honestly very disappointed with how my shots came out. As I said that I had to rely on manual focus, filming action shots was a disaster, especially when it came to filming these coyotes I spotted. I was really excited to spot them and really wanted to film them, but they were running pretty fast, so getting to focus on them was nearly impossible. In fact, even just trying to find them in frame was pretty hard, since they were about 500 or so feet away. It was a pretty hard day to shoot, and the sun has now set, so time for bed. After nearly a week in Alamosa, we were off to hit the road again, and this time we were driving west to Utah. Although we only stayed there for the weekend, we did quite a lot. We visited two of the most beautiful parks in the country, Zion National Park and Bryce Canyon. I honestly knew nothing about Zion National Park before arriving here, and I was truly mesmerized by its magnificence. Just overlooking the vast canyon in front of me was very surreal and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Right after Zion, we went to Bryce Canyon during sunset, and it was at both parks where I got some more wildlife shots. I saw some bighorn sheep at Zion, and I spotted some mule deer at both Zion and Bryce Canyon. Although I faced the same problems with the Canon lens and the Sony as I did earlier, I think my shots look a little better this time. For one thing, the wildlife at these parks were much closer and they weren't moving as much, so getting some clean shots wasn't as difficult. One thing that kind of surprised me at these places was the fact that the wildlife was all right off the side of the road, where I would least expect to see them. That's why when shooting wildlife, it's very important to always be prepared, because you never know if and when you'll spot something. As I continue to lay in this hammock reflecting on my trip, I guess it would be pretty easy to say that my first attempt at wildlife filming wasn't a real success, as I was hoping to capture the kinds of shots that you would see on National Geographic. However, there are a number of things that I learned from this experience which will definitely come in handy next time I decide to go film outdoors. I definitely do want to shoot wildlife again in the future, and when I do, I will be using a lens that I know will work with Sony, whether that's a Sigma or a native Sony lens. To conclude this commentary, I'm just going to say that this is not a knock on this lens. This is a great lens. The problem is, however, that I tried to pair this with the Sony. And many of you probably know this already, but when you are using a Canon lens, it almost always eliminates all the functionalities that come with a Sony camera. I have heard of photographers having some luck though when trying this out with the MC11 adapter, at least when it comes to taking photos. However, another thing to keep in mind is that this is a telephoto lens, not your regular, say, 18 or 50 millimeter lens, which means that getting your image focused will be even harder. One more thing I learned that seems pretty obvious, yet it's very important, is that when you're shooting wildlife, don't go handheld like I did. Always use a tripod. The only reason I didn't bring a tripod was because it would have just been more luggage for my flight, and I tried my best to travel light for this trip. Regardless of how my footage came out, I'm just so happy that I got to visit all these places across the country, as I know many people may never get to see them in their lifetime. And I've always wanted to see the great wildlife out here for myself, and I'm really grateful for that. At the very least, I think I got at least a few good shots. I saw some of the great wonders of this country, I met some really cool people from all kinds of backgrounds, and felt the most inspired to create and tell stories than ever before. I sure hope I can make it out here again someday. Until then, I will see you on the other side. Peace.